What's going on today, you beautiful, blessed boys and girls? Thanks so much for tuning into the channel. Today, I'm probably more fired up than I've ever been to put out this video, and I really hope you guys enjoy it. Pretty open on the channel. I shared my testimony a while back, but a few years back, I swapped addictions of alcohol, pornography, and some really other toxic self-destructive behaviors for addictions into studying Jesus, the Bible, the Word, getting my body healthy, my mind healthy, my soul healthy. And so as I've kind of really started reading the Bible every day, I listen to multiple sermons a week, it's been kind of put on my heart to share some of the insights and some of the takeaways I learn as I'm studying the Bible and put those out here. So I don't know if you guys want to call this first ever sermon that I'm going to put out. I don't know if I really if I really want to say that, but I do want to highlight today one of my favorite characters of the Bible and put this out here. It's King David. I relate very much to King David as he lives a life of very highs and very lows, and he has these very defined seasons of his life. I think we can learn some massive lessons from him. Before I get into this, I want to say I'm not a Bible scholar. I haven't been to theology school. I don't have any degrees for this. So if you find something in my study or mine, just be kind, point it out, and let's learn and grow together. That's always my goal with all this. So I want to dive in today to King David, the top 3 lessons I think we can take away from his life, plus a unique perspective I'd never heard shared in any other sermons or things I listened to about the Israeli army as it relates to Goliath and some things there. So let's hop in today, baby. Watching this, you're probably familiar with David and Goliath, right? David, just a young man tending to his father's flock, this massive giant warrior of warriors who challenges every day, mocks the Israeli army. No one will challenge him and fight him. He comes out every day taunting them. And then this young shepherd boy, David, comes up and says, I will fight him. We're all familiar with how that story ends as David defeats him. But I want to offer a unique perspective today, and one that I think most people don't really think about. I'm going to start in 1 Samuel 17:34 and read that verse together. It says, there were times I was once taking care of my father's sheep, once a lion and another time a bear. I chased them. I wounded those animals. I attacked them and killed them. In other verses, it talks about David always staying vigilant. He was always tending to his father's sheep, doing a great job. He was trusted with these small tasks, right, to take care of sheep. But daily, he did the right thing. It talks in other verses how he had praise music on all the time. He was in constant harmony with God, walking with God. And so, I think we think sometimes when he goes to fight the giant, he goes to fight Goliath, or we can apply that to our own lives as what our giants are. We think of God as this get out of jail free card. Hey, God, help me with this thing, right? Hey, God, I'm stressed about this. Those are most of our prayers, right? Hey, God, help. We see David walk right up here just, confident, tells King Saul, I will go fight him. I took care of a lion. I took care of a bear. God's with me. I'll go take care of this guy. No problem. Well, where does that confidence come from? I think that's the really unique perspective here. And the cool thing was, I think, we look at David's daily habits. What was he doing every day? He didn't know this day was going to be the day that would change the rest of his life. It was probably just any other day. He woke up. He did his good little daily habits. He was in harmony with God. His dad asked him to go take some food to his brothers at battle. He hears this giant taunting and he says, I can take him on. I'm fine. God is with me. But I don't think that confidence comes from just crying out to God in times of need and saying, hey, God, rescue me. Please save me. I think that confidence is bred through daily habits. And I was really convicted when I first started reading this because, my daily habits were not so much to lean into God. I was more of that Christian that would say, hey, God, I need something. Maybe I'll say thanks here and there, but it wasn't this daily relationship that I think God seeks with us. And so I think the big first lesson we can take away from David's life is God is not a get out of jail free card. God is not somebody we can just call upon to save us. We need to be in constant harmony with him. We need to be very mindful and intentional with our daily routines, with our daily habits, and seek God first. For me, what this looks like a little bit is I get up in the morning every day, write a few things I'm grateful for, and pray over those things. I just say, hey, God, thank you for the gift of a new day. I say a few affirmations and I get into the Word and I read at least a chapter of the Bible every day. I try and start the day with God. I don't listen to any other music anymore outside of praise music and Jesus music. I like it to flood my soul. I use David as an example for that. I've swapped Netflix and all the shows I used to watch for additional sermons. And I'm not saying you need to do all these things at once, but I am saying I think we can learn a lot from David in this story. I don't think if he hadn't been doing all these right things, he would have walked up and had that confidence to go slay that giant and go fight him on the battlefield. As we journey through seasons of life and things are hard, I think we're often going to face our giants too, right? And they look different for all of us. For some of us, it might be a health issue. It might be a a marital issue. It might be a job issue. So I think we need to get intentional. And the first lesson I'm going to say is to really think about your day. How intentional are you day to day in interacting with God? How intentional are you on having a relationship with Jesus? He doesn't really want all the rules. He wants our heart. He wants a fellowship with him. And so I think it's very, very vital that we really examine our day. And, King David in a psalm later would say, "Search me, O God. Search me and find me." I think we can ask God, and I try and do this often. Hey, God, tell me where I'm lacking. Tell me where I need to grow closer to you. And I think that's something we all really need to do and prioritize and be very intentional about. I definitely used to be a Sunday Christian. If I'm very honest, when I first kind of started walking the walk, I was that guy who's going to take the cute family picture on a Sunday, talk to the preacher, shake his hand. Oh, we're great, right? But then I was going to go do my thing during the rest of the week and go do my thing when I wanted to. And I was only going to give God certain parts of my life. And I'm just going to tell you, fellow believer and fellow friend, you don't see the miracles then. You don't get to defeat the giants then. You don't get to walk up with confidence then and say, "I know he that lives in me is greater than he that lives in the world. I'm not afraid." I see a lot of Christians walking around today afraid. And I look at some stats and I say, the average American watches 25 hours a week of TV. 25 hours a week, that's an insane amount. When they polled the same audience, less than 10% said they open their Bible once a week. That's just a shame. That's a travesty, and we need to fix that. A lot of people talk about this is what's wrong with society or that. It starts right there. It starts with your daily habits and routines. If we're watching 25 hours a week of TV and we're not opening our Bible, we might as well just say it what it is. We're telling God, "You're not as important to me as this show. I'd rather veg out and consume this stuff than I would study your word and live by your principles and learn and get to know you more." So I think we need to all have a hard look, myself included, at our day-to-day actions. One of my favorite verses here comes at the end in 1 Samuel 17:45. I'm going to put it up here. David says, "You come at me with a sword, spear, and a javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord that rules over all. This very day, I'll strike you down." Now, again, God was prepping David long before Goliath. And so David won that battle long before he faced Goliath. He won that battle with his daily actions, with his daily habits. I'm a big basketball guy too. One of my favorite players is Dame Lillard. I absolutely love this guy. And he had a quote that really hit me hard a couple years back. He said, "If you want to look good in front of thousands, you have to outwork thousands in front of nobody." In other words, when nobody's looking, when it's easy to sit down on the couch, when it's easy to sleep in, when it's easy to not dig into the word and really get to know God and really push yourself to grow in these other areas, that's when the biggest wins happen. And so I challenge you today, and I challenge myself to really take a look again and see where we can plug God more into our lives, or we can plug good daily habits that are going to make us better into our lives. I'm the first to admit now, and I tell a funny story quite often to people who really know me, that there's days when I feel really attacked now, really anxious. I feel the enemy getting in my thoughts, telling me I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm not good at this, I can't do that. Even giving this sermon, if I'm very honest, there's a lot of things saying, "Hey, Ty, you know who you were in the past? You shouldn't be putting this out there, man. People know that you were a drinker, a partier, a this, or that. You can't do that, right?" And so what I do is I go back to God and those daily habits, and I yell at the enemy and I say, "I see you. You might come at me with those anxious thoughts. You might come at me with that worry, what other people think, that fear. You might come at me with that. But I come in the name of the Lord, baby. I come at you with he that lives in me." And so I challenge you today to really take a hard look at those daily habits. How much time are you spending with God? Can you carve out 5-10 minutes in the morning? Can you swap a little of the news radio for the praise music? Can you swap a commute in the car with a daily prayer and just having some communion? Instead of the nightly show, can you turn on a sermon? Can you really study the word more and get into the word? So that's takeaway one. Get intentional with your daily habits. A side note lesson I want to take here too quickly is the Israeli army. I found it really interesting that, a whole host of warriors in this army that had been victorious in many battles was camped out, and for many days on end, this giant would come out and taunt them, would yell at them, you have no chance, I'll kill you, I'll feed you to the birds, I'll just taunting them, talking trash every day. Not once did anybody rise up and say, "You know what, God's given us victory before, I'll take that challenge." I just found that very interesting, and then I applied that back to my own life, and I thought, man, how long did I let the enemy, or a giant, or whatever you want to call it, come into my mind and come into my voice and taunt me every day? You're just created with anxiety. That's just who you are. You're just not a good sleeper. You just can't overcome that. That's who you are. You just have an addictive personality. You can't have one drink, man. That's just who you are. You're an alcoholic. You're just addicted to pornography, man. You'll never get over that. The giant would taunt me and taunt me and taunt me, and day in and day out, I listened to that voice. Craig Groeschel, one of my favorite preachers, has this thing, there's always two voices every day. There's worship and there's worry. There's gratitude and there's grumbling. There's faith and there's fear. And we can choose every day which voice we listen to. Now that giant, that Goliath that's in our minds that comes out is often the loudest. But I gotta urge you today to shout back and to realize that you do have that power in you. At any moment, you can call upon that spirit. When Jesus ascended to heaven, one of my favorite things he said is, I give you my powers. The Spirit lives in you. You can do the things I did on earth and even greater things. So, when I feel that enemy attacking me now, first thing I do is I fire on the praise music. I get out in the garage, ripping off some pull-ups or push-ups, and I shout back. I shout back. I'm not in chains. I'm not in bondage. I have no strongholds. He who the Son sets free is free indeed, and I am free. And so are you. And so when you hear that voice come in, when you hear that giant speaking into your life, just understand that you have the power at any moment to pause, pray, give that over to Jesus and say, the Spirit that lives in me is greater than that fear, is greater than that anxiety, is greater than that worry, is greater than that health problem, is greater than that marital issue. Whatever it is that you might face, it's greater than that. And you don't have to listen to that voice. You don't have to be a slave and a prisoner to that giant coming out and taunting you every day. You don't have to put up with it anymore. I see too many Christians walking around now lukewarm, just giving into these voices, giving into fear. We don't need to do that anymore. And I think we can use that Israeli army perspective there to say, why didn't anybody stand up and fight back? It's so obvious. A little 13-year-old boy came in and defeated that giant with God's help. You have the power to defeat any giant in your life with God's help today too. The second big lesson I think we can take from King David's life, and I think, again, you're probably familiar with the story of Bathsheba. David, the king, is up on his balcony or roof, and he looks over and he sees a young, attractive female named Bathsheba taking a bath, and he desires her. And he says, I want her. And so he summons her. He sleeps with her, gets her pregnant. To try and bail himself out of trouble, he actually sends Uriah back home, which is one of his lead generals and a man very loyal to him, to try and have him, sleep with his wife and cover it up so it doesn't look like David got her pregnant, but, Uriah did. When this plan doesn't work, David actually sends Uriah back to the battlefield with a note. That note would actually be Uriah's death sentence, as that note he would hand to a higher general would tell him to put Uriah on the front lines, and David would have him killed to cover this up. So a sin probably greater than any of us will ever commit, although all sins are equal. It's hard to say, sleeping with another man's wife and killing him to cover it up. That's a pretty big one. That's one that would be hard to overcome. And so I want to dig into that a little bit today and kind of ask some questions around that. I think the first takeaway I had, and this was a big one that I hadn't heard talked about much, but my first thought was David's entire army was out fighting. Why was David not there? David was back in the palace. As king, he has the privilege to do whatever he wants at that point. I mean, we think of a guy like Elon Musk today being the richest guy in the world. Kings back then, dwarfed the kind of wealth and power that some of these guys have today. People said he had 800 wives, some of these kings, and all kinds of things, right? And so, he was clearly very comfortable back in his palace while his men were out fighting the battle. As I kind of examined myself through that story and I kind of think about us as a society today, I think, how many men, especially of us, have just gotten comfortable? We're not fighting battles, man. We're not out there anymore, right? We got the cushy job, the cushy house, the cushy marriage, the cushy life. Food's delivered to our doorstep. We don't ever push ourselves. We're not out there fighting the battle. An old English proverb says, an idle mind is the devil's playground. Man, do I see this very, very much in my life and in a lot of society today. We're just so comfortable. Again, we got 500 channels on demand. We got food delivered to our doorstep in a minute. We don't have to go out and hunt or fight or really do much anymore physically, and that leads to idle minds. The devil loves this, I think. You take even a further step and say, we're not in community a lot. We're alone when a lot of these attacks come. David was seemingly alone at his palace, not in battle. If he had been out in battle pushing himself, not there by himself when that temptation hit, think of all the turmoil he would have saved. This one decision not only murdered an innocent man, changed his family's lives for generations down the line. So I think we can apply that lesson to ourselves and say, I don't want to be so comfortable. I don't want to have an idle mind. I don't want to allow myself to have so much free time and so much comfort that I can just have time to have the pornography addiction or have the the comfort crisis. One of the books I just read that was a great one is Comfort Crisis. I'd recommend you check it out. It reminded me a lot of this story. And I think especially as men, we need to have challenges. We're created to be setting goals, conquering challenges. At this point in my life, I cannot fathom sitting for an hour and not having anything to do. I always have goals. I'm trying to raise my standards, set higher benchmarks to conquer these new things. I would urge you to do the same. Maybe you got to a spot in life where I was about 4 or 5 years ago where I really didn't have any. I worked a pretty cushy job managing a bank. That was, I just came home and kind of vegged out to TV every day. I didn't really have a mission, didn't really have a purpose. I was providing for my family, doing the bare minimum. That's what society says. You're fine, right? But I didn't have an on-fire marriage. I didn't have an on-fire dad life. I didn't have a good body, a good bank account, a strong faith, a lot of these things I desire. And so I would challenge you today to use the lesson from David's life to not be so comfortable. Don't put yourself in a spot to where you're just bored and so you're sinning or you're looking for these bad things to do because you just don't have a mission, you don't have a purpose, you don't have something bigger than yourself. A lot of this sin starts really small, right? I think if somebody had warned David, hey David, just by looking down at Bathsheba, you're going to murder her husband, you're going to do all these terrible things, he probably would have laughed. He said, it's just a look. She's attractive. What am I supposed to do? I'm a guy. It's just a look. It's just a taste. It's just one time. Nobody will know. It won't hurt anybody. We justify this sin all the time, and we really, if we're not in constant communion with God and the Spirit, we can almost justify anything. It's scary how our minds can rationalize and justify our actions. And so, as I was really reading over this and studying this, I want to challenge you and myself today to really take a hard look at the things we consume. There wasn't that long ago where me and my wife, it was a few years ago, watching a show called Game of Thrones. A new season came out about a year ago, and we turned on an episode, and my wife said right away, I don't want to put this in my head. This is so of the world. I don't want this stuff in my head. I agree with her, and she was absolutely right. I think we need to be careful not to allow some of the norms of society today and some of the things that, everybody says is okay. It's just a little bit. It's just a little bit of nudity in the show. It's just a little bit of this, just a little bit of that. That stuff leads to bigger things. As I went down a rabbit hole, and I'm doing another YouTube video right now about a lot of these convicted serial rapists, all of them said they started. Every single one that I've read, that all their interviews started with just a little pornography. That was it. Harmless pornography. Then when that wasn't enough, the pornography escalated to more violent stuff, and more violent stuff, and more violent stuff. And then they wanted to act on it. And then they wanted to do it when even the girl didn't want it. And then they wanted to, and if you had told maybe that 18-year-old boy, hey man, just by looking at pornography here the first time, this is going to lead you down this terrible path, he'd probably laugh at you. The same way King David probably would have laughed if you would have said, hey man, just by looking down at this thing and doing this one little wrong thing, it can snowball, and it has a tendency to do that. That's how sin works. It starts small. So I urge you today to pray about it, to really think about it, journal about it, whatever that looks like for you, and ask God again to search you. I ask God to search me. I don't want to put myself in those gray areas anymore. I don't want to give the devil a foothold. I don't want to allow him to try and get into my mind and say, it's okay, Ty, it's just a touch, just a taste, just a look, no big deal. It is a big deal, and those things can snowball and lead us down destructive paths. They can ruin our entire lives. We've seen it before. I've seen preachers that preach the word of God every day, that then all of a sudden, a few years later, it comes out that they're having an affair or they're doing some other nefarious activities. If you had told them that just by looking at that one pornographic image would have led them down that road, or, they lose their job from alcohol, well, just that one sip when you first started, and, oh, it's just one night a week, it's just 2 nights a week, it's just a few nights a week, it's just 1 or 2, it's no big deal. How that stuff can snowball. My wife and I have had the privilege of working in foster care for the last few years, and adopted 2 boys out of that. We reunified 5 children back home. And me and my wife have this saying all the time that, we feel so much empathy for a lot of the foster parents. Sometimes there's mental illness and there's nothing they can do, but oftentimes it's drugs, it's meth, it's crack, it's these drugs. And I always think back now when I look at them about that very first time that they chose to take that hit. The very first time they did meth. Maybe they were 16, somebody gave it to them, maybe they were 20, I don't know. But look at how that ruined their lives. We've met, moms now that have lost 10 kids or more. Their whole life is just in shambles now. And it all started with that first time, that first hit. And so I urge you today to not go into the gray. There are truths and basic principles that we need to follow that are for our own good. I used to think that God was this guy who just had some of these rules up to stop us from having fun. The older I get and the more wisdom that he gives me, I really realize that, man, these rules are set for my peace. They're not to stop me from having fun. They're really guidelines that can give me a deeper sense of purpose, joy, meaning, and passion, and really love life. And God sets these principles for us. So don't try and justify them. Don't try and rationalize it's just okay, a little here, a little there. I urge you today to take a deep look. What's the one thing that you can cut out of your life that maybe you're kind of crossing an area in that you need to cut out today? The third lesson I want to highlight today starts in 2 Samuel 12. That's where God sends a prophet, Nathan, at the time, to tell David a story. And he tells David this story of a ruler in a kingdom who had 1,000 sheep, great wealth, and basically everything that he could have. And there was one other poor man in that village who had only one lamb. That lamb grew up with him and his children and his family. And that ruler then actually saw that poor man and ended up stealing his sheep, his family lamb. When David heard this, he was very upset, and he said to Nathan, "Bring me this man, I'm going to have his head." Nathan looked at David and said, "You're that man. You stole Uriah's wife. You did all these things." What happens next is really interesting. David doesn't justify it. David doesn't say, "It wasn't my fault. She shouldn't have been out there bathing. She shouldn't have been this." I've read some other stories about that where some people try and justify David's actions. David instantly repents. He instantly goes right back and says, "I've sinned against God." So God disciplines David, which often happens with our sin. I alluded to earlier, that God doesn't really set these parameters for us to try and keep us from having fun, but for us to live a better life. And I think David starts to see this as, hey, this caused a lot of turmoil. This caused a man to die. All these things I did had dire consequences. And so David pays the price. Even down the line, his children pay a price later. But instantly Nathan says, God will forgive you. And God does tell him, "I will discipline you, but you will not die today. I am going to restore you." And later on, God would, even after all this, God would go on to call David a man after my own heart. Now, friends, I'm going to tell you, there's been many times in my life where I've been at very low points. And I think back to this verse where God says, "You're a man after my own heart." Even after David sinned so big. I always joked, when I first came back to Christ, that nobody could sin as big as I could. I wanted to see just how low I could go. In fact, me and my sister had a funny saying where I would tell her, I want to be like the sewage of the scum just to see how low I could literally take my life. God even restores us no matter how far we've gone in that other direction. God can always pull us back. And that was my big takeaway from this as I kept reading through this story. It's just an amazing thing what grace is, what mercy is, how much God loves us. There's been a few days here recently in the last couple of weeks where I've been brought to tears even at the gym, certain songs or certain sermons, just thinking about how much God, our Creator, sent His only Son to die for me, for you. If we were the only people on earth, He would have sent Jesus to die for you, how much He loves you. As a dad, I think of myself, man, with my kids, how much I love them. I want nothing more than for my kids to just be near me, be around me, be on my lap, just hanging out. That's my favorite thing in life. I think God thinks the same about you. He just wants to be near you. He wants to have a relationship with you. He wants to get to know you. He wants you to be open and honest with Him. Not every prayer needs to be a, "Hey God, I'm so thankful for this." Some of your prayers can be, "Hey God, I'm really struggling here. Hey God, I'm grateful for this. Hey God, just wanted to say thanks." He wants a relationship. He wants your heart. And I think it's such a cool takeaway here at the end of this story, how God restores David, calls him a man after my own heart. David goes back to God, and he takes that first step back, and that next step back, and that next step back. I remember when my life was at its very lowest point. I reached out to a preacher named Eddie Lowen, a guy that I really looked up to at the time, and I didn't have much faith. And I said, "Eddie, I've gone too far. You don't know the things I've done. I can't come back, man. I just can't." And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Hey, Ty, you don't have to run the whole race today. All you have to do is pump the brakes and take one step back. God will start to restore you wherever you're at. He'll meet you where you're at. You don't need to have it all put together and then come to find Jesus. You need to find Jesus, and He'll put you all back together." And boy, have those words been true over the last 7, 8, 10 years of my life. So I see God just continuing to restore me and build me and work in my life. He can do the same for you. So I urge you today too to not be one of those Christians also that looks down on people. I want to make this a point too, because I kind of have the saying that nothing keeps non-believers out of church like Christians. How many times do we say, not them? I experienced a little bit myself when I was, drinking 6 days a week, and I'd still show up to church, and people didn't want to be associated with me, man. That's the guy who was out partying last night. We need to be the kind of people who meet people where they are. It's not our job to restore them. It's our job to show the love of Christ and let God do the work, to plant the seed. I'll wrap up just by saying, thanks for tuning in. We're all sinners today. Every one of us here. There's one perfect person to walk the earth. It's not me. Clearly, it's not you. It's Jesus. And the more I study Jesus, the more I see he hung around with those people who, were not the elites of society. He hung around the sinners. He hung around the prostitutes. He hung around the tax collectors. He hung around the people that nobody else wanted to associate with. So why then as Christians are we not inviting all these people to church and saying, you're welcome? You're welcome. There's room at the table for everybody. We don't need to judge everybody. We need to invite them. We need to live in a way that shows Jesus is in us. He's impacted our life. There's nothing better to me than when a buddy will say, hey, Ty, you're different. What is it? Haven't hung out with you in a few years. A poker buddy from town. Haven't hung out with you. You're different. What is it? Let me tell you about Jesus that lives in me, man. That's what's different. That should be our testimony day in and day out. So thanks for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. I'll link my testimony below to this too. I'd encourage you to share your testimony. Let's start speaking more openly about Jesus. I don't really understand why, we've been singing this little song with my 2-year-old sons now. They love it. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And hide it under a bushel, and we say, no, I'm going to let it shine. And so I leave you with that encouragement today to go live an on-fire life. Get in tune with Jesus. Talk to him every day. Have that fellowship. Communicate with other believers. Surround yourself in that community, and don't look down on anybody. Invite everybody else in. I think we can learn so much from the life of David and from studying the Bible in general. I look forward to putting a few more of these out. Let me know comments, anything below where I could improve it. Maybe anything in the scripture that I had might have been wrong or anything. I always want to try and improve the process. So let me know. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you. Go have the most blessed day of your life. God is good.